Sure. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. My name is Chris Gore, and I've introduced myself a few times already, but I'll do it once more. I'm a faculty member at a university called Ryerson University, which is in Toronto. And I also have the pleasure of being editor of Review of Policy Research, which I'm sure some copies of that have been pushed on you in your bag. So my position as editor began, I think, almost 1 year and a half ago. And I followed from JP, and Zach has been heavily involved in the journal as well. The idea of the panels was really more of a roundtable, but there's an interesting benefit to being an editor, and that is that you're routinely on the supply side, seeing what people are pushing as they think is important research. But you also have that novel position of actually soliciting work as well, and suggesting that there are holes in some areas, and there are certain things that you think would be beneficial for the community that reads your journal or might be interested in the journal. So that demand supply as an editor role has been certainly front and center for me. And actually, you'll talk a bit about that as well. But the other part of that is, as someone who teaches comparative policy and works with graduate students and tries to understand the history and evolution of policy research, most know full well that there's been an interesting evolution over time about the sort of trend between demand and supply, and who's actually doing demand and demanding what kind of research, and obviously what scholars are able to do and researchers are able to do to actually respond to that. And sometimes they mix very well, and the private sector plays a very important role as well. But other times there's a pretty interesting divide as to what seems to be important and not. So the idea of this panel, thankfully we have two people, I don't say they represent the demand side, but two people who are working in government and federal agencies, and obviously two very accomplished scholars in science and technology. So I've asked each of them to make some reflections on the general issue of demand and supply, but also just generally about the future directions in science, tech, and environmental policy research. And I think, well, I would probably restrict them to about 8 or 10 minutes, so we can have room for discussion. And I'll say a few words just about the journal and what the state of kind of work that's being submitted now. But I'll save the time for the time. Thank you.
That's great. I'm going to restrict each of our speakers to approximately 8 minutes. We won't exactly hold them tight to that, but unlike other panels, I think once you go over 10, you're going to cut off. So I'll start with Zach. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. And again, I encourage you beforehand, definitely cut me off if I go long and all. So my name is Mark Zachary Taylor. I used to be a physicist a long time ago when I went over to the light side and became a political scientist. And I study why are some countries better than others in science and technology. And I'm currently at Georgia Institute of Technology right now at the Sam Nunn Schools of International Affairs. So in various positions, I've gotten not only doing my own research, but gotten a bird's eye view of what various people across the disciplines are doing on this question of why are some countries better at science and technology than others. And the answers come in two flavors, and I'll give you three things that I think that we need to be looking at in the future. The two flavors are basically governments need to be solving market failures, and governments need to be helping create and foster networks. Now, market failures we kind of get. We want to subsidize research and development because it's typically capture the benefits. Because people can lead, ideas are fungible, people can just copy technology. So you need things like intellectual property rights, patent systems. You also need S&T funding. You need a good financial system that's going to channel savings towards these new investments, et cetera, et cetera. So we get market failures in what governments do. Networks, there hasn't been as much work on, but we understand if anyone gets politics or business at all, we know that networks are very important there. We're gathering together skilled people together with resources and different skill sets to make things happen. The same thing as scientists in science and technology. You don't want to just gather the scientists together within your country. You want to network them with ones outside of your country and also tie them together with finance, venture capital, marketing, distribution, production, entrepreneurs. And when you get these people together in the same networks, good stuff happens. And when you look at some of the miracle stories out there like Taiwan, Israel, they've been very good about doing these things. But it's difficult to translate into specific policies. What should government be doing to help foster these networks? So that's number one thing I might want to take a look at, is how do we turn this theory about networks of S&T and innovation into practice? The Second is that as a political scientist, I'm very aware of the fact that, okay, everyone loves science and technology, but science and technology creates winners and losers. And the losers often say, hey, we want to slow this down because we're losing out on it. So the question is, once you've got these good policies, why are some countries better at creating and maintaining, sustaining those policies over time? And that has to do with the politics, with the losers saying, look, if you're going to spend more on S&T, that means you're going to have to raise my taxes, or you're going to have to take that money from some other program. And the people who are going to pay those taxes, or whose program is going to lose out, they're going to object. They're not going to object to science and technology in general, they're going to object to that technology in particular. Wow, it's too risky, it costs too much, it's hurting our natural culture, it's destroying jobs in this industry, it's dangerous, we need to regulate it. And as those build up, it slows down progress in science and technology. So understanding the interest group battles that affect the policies is another area that needs a deeper look, and that would be number two. The third thing is I would bring these two aspects together, the market failures networks and the interest group battles, to talk about getting minorities into science. It's fairly common knowledge that minorities, gender, ethnic, etc., are underrepresented in the sciences. And yet these are the fields that are getting the higher and higher incomes and the better and better positions in both industries, government, and within academia. So and you get some minorities participating at the basic level, like women are now filling out the undergrad classes, but they have this leaky pipeline where they're not appearing in the higher levels, they're getting pushed out somehow. And so not just solving the market failures, but providing minorities with the resources to enter and perform in these areas, but also getting them involved in the networks of mentoring, of getting patents, of translating what's going on in the lab into goods and services being sold on the market, getting them as business communities. I think these are issues that need to be looked at the policy level, and a place where academics and policymakers can come together. So those three things: understanding better what governments can do to foster networks for science, technology, and innovation, looking at how winners and losers fight over the goodies and how you can design policies to make those fights more constructive rather than destructive, and finally applying that knowledge to helping promote minorities within science and technology at all levels. Otherwise, we're going to see inequality grow over the next few decades as much as we've seen it shrink, and that would be a terrible thing.
No, right on to me. Okay. So, hi, Koizumi. I'm at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and I'm Assistant Director for Federal Research and Development there. And so what I try to do is
Louder.
Louder? All right. So what I try to do is to implement some of the Obama administration objectives in science and technology within the federal budgets for research and development among the various federal agencies that fund research. So let me say what I can about the demand side of federal government policy, because, well, federal government does demand a lot of research, and often pays for that research. And so some areas that I see as opportunities or possibilities for the coming years are, first let me start with this area of science policy, which is an ongoing effort by the federal government, but given renewed importance in recent years, first by the late Dr. Marburger, who was the director of OSTP in the last administration, and renewed and sustained in this administration. And the basics of that is that for science policy, we need research to better understand the U.S. government-supported science and engineering enterprise and how policy interacts with it. Some examples that I would give are that we need some better tools, a more robust toolkit for evaluating the outputs and outcomes of federal research and development investments, including, of course, policy outcomes. How does the knowledge and technology base that the federal R&D investment produces lead to improved policy making? I think we also need a data infrastructure, a better data infrastructure for collecting data and linking inputs to outputs and outcomes. Earlier this morning, we had a discussion across the hall over one effort in that area, which is the STAR metrics effort. Another example is that I think we all continue to need better understanding of the micro level impacts of federal R&D investments on desired outcomes. Right now, in the policy arena, everyone, of course, is interested in innovation, economic competitiveness. And we have, fairly robust literature, could be better, but we have robust literature on the aggregate economic impacts of government investments in research and development. But as still very difficult to tie toward, smaller units of analysis, such as individual programs or individual areas of research. And so that is still an area where work needs to be done, so we can begin to make some choices within the overall science and engineering enterprise. A second area that I think is going to be important is that there is a push to do more SBE research, social behavior and economic sciences research, including policy-related research, because we know that when putting together policies, some national goals can't be met by S&T alone. It can't be met by policy alone, because it's really humans who ultimately drive change. And effective policies really need to understand the human factor of how we all use science. We use new knowledge and we use technology. Some examples are in the areas of clean energy, where there is a push for the energy department and other departments to do more than just develop better technologies, but take a look at how we, as energy consumers in the United States, actually use energy, and how we might adopt or not adopt new clean energy technology. We're looking at the area of SBE research in health, where we have, of course, medical breakthroughs and discoveries, but if we want to really solve the challenges in areas such as obesity or improving human nutrition, we need to understand better how humans actually eat and what drives these decisions. And another area in which there's increasing emphasis on social sciences research is in the financial services sector. That is how consumers actually interact with the banking system. And that, of course, it has been given renewed emphasis because of the financial crisis over the last few years. So the administration has been trying to expand SBE research in these areas, not always successfully, because there has been some resistance. And we're trying to focus on how innovations and policies get translated into behavior and people's choices. I will also add to that list climate change adaptation research in particular, and also climate change mitigation research, because an important question coming up for us in this century is how we as a society, how we as individuals adapt to changes in climate, or how we try to mitigate its impacts. And we know that all of this is a human endeavor involving complex interactions between people, policies, and the environment. And we don't know enough about those interactions. I think a third area of research is in the entire field of ethical, legal, and social implications of various technologies, or ELSI research. Nanotechnology is one area in which the ELSI portfolio has been existing for a while now. But you can imagine that there are some new areas of opportunity for ELSI research in topics such as synthetic biology, or in climate remediation, or geoengineering, whichever term you would like to use. And an ongoing challenge for all of these ELSI research efforts is how to incorporate insights from that research back into the science and research agenda, and also in the policy process. And so fourth, I will put out that a little bit of an overlap with what I said before, that there are some newly funded areas of research. And one in particular is the comparative effectiveness research in healthcare. That is, how effective are certain treatments and therapies within our healthcare system. That is a little bit outside of the purview of what we're talking about here at this meeting, but it is an area that is now guaranteed to have funding over the next decade because of the healthcare reform law. And it obviously involves a great deal of social sciences, as well as looking at the medical effectiveness of some treatments. Another area in which there is funding, thanks to the Dodd-Frank bill, is the financial services research, as I said before. The Department of Treasury does have a new research office for the first time that is going to be looking at a lot of the financial transactions data that are out there, looking for patterns and looking how consumers are impacted by financial innovations. So those are some of the areas that I see as opportunities for research. With the caveat, of course, that policies change, research agenda does change because, of course, politicians and policies change. But given that caveat, I will provide that as kind of a portrait of how I see the future directions of research going, and I wish us all luck in pursuing those research areas. Thank you.
JP?
I'm JP Singh. I'm a professor at the Communication Culture Technology program at Georgetown. When Professor Gore asked us to think about the demand and supply issues of science technology scholarship, I thought I'll speak more just to the supply side of things, but I guess we haven't been the former editor of RPR, we've also been on the demand side of things. So the best way to sort of place my intervention here would be to talk of the value chain of science technology policy and where people like me come in. When I say me, I'm talking about the sort of community of researchers gathered here who look at science and technology issues. And I would say that we're somewhere in between the demand and supply, and we're sort of a creaky wheel. We've done some things well and some things we haven't. And so the main thing I want to put forth is that STS scholarship as a whole started off as a questioning of big science. Until then, the world of science had been sort of divorced from the world of politics, and in many ways, in the 60s and 70s, STN stepped in and said, we need to question this. This is not about science, this is about politics at some level. And I think it was a phenomenal contribution because from there we got agencies like the Office for Technology Assessment and others to say it's not just science when we talk of birth control. It's not just science in the present day when we talk of genetic engineering. It is also about politics. So we've delivered well, I think, on that big goal that there are politics to each and every science or technology agenda. I think where we haven't delivered well is to speak effectively to the many quarters, be they scientists or political scientists or the policy makers with the findings that we have as STS scholars. It's great to know that there's funding available, and it's very nice to know that networks like this, which bring interdisciplinary communities together. So what I'm going to say is mostly in terms of my experience as having headed the Science, Technology, Environment, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association for about 6 years, then having jump-started in many ways review of policy research as a journal which focuses on the politics and policy of science and technology. We were, I think, only going to call it the policy of science and technology, and Zach said, no, we need to put the word politics into it too. And so we have now politics and policy of science and technology. So that's what you inherited. And I think Chris has just done such a phenomenal job with the journal, so my congratulations to him as well. So what have we done and what have we not done? I think we've moved beyond technology assessment to talk about deliberation. Okay? And that's kind of the moment we are. If I had to sort of put one word on where we are in terms of that kind of technology assessment literature, is to say that there's a deliberative aspect of technology from the local level to the global level, and this is the form that the deliberation takes. Or this is the form that normatively it could or should take. And agencies like the NSF or other places, even the National Institutes of Health, etc., in this country, have financed that kind of research to say, what is that form of deliberation and does it matter? I think, unfortunately, that I don't think the scientists are still persuaded on that. Maybe because STS scholars haven't talked back to science, because we mostly question big science, so we have a really pitiable record of talking to scientists. So, Zach talks about having seen the light from being a physicist to an STS scholar, but a lot of the political scientists may not have seen that same light themselves. I don't think we've evolved a language where we can effectively really talk to scientists without first coming off as, we're just here to question everything that you do. And so I think that in some ways, that dialogue in terms of deliberation between scientists and STS scholars has not quite gotten bridged. So in terms of pushing it further, I would say that that's a really ripe area of inquiry. Now, in micro quarters, that's already beginning to happen. I saw from RPR or from my involvement in the STEP section that individual researchers are very much involved with particular types of agencies, like I think all the STEP scholars who have worked with EPA or other agencies. So at that level, it's still happening. But at the macro level, what would be an effective language to engage STS scholars with scientists, I think still needs to go forth. Second one would be where I think the scientists could engage with STS scholars more effectively is the question of values. Okay? What are the values in terms of deliberation that could be fostered? I think to say economic competitiveness is a value. Okay? Why should we be economically competitive versus economically sustainable to following a development agenda, to speaking of effective global governance? The fact that we call it economic competitiveness of innovation, that's a particular kind of value that we attach to research, which then funds public policy agendas and funds researchers on that. So where do these values come from? How do those values influence scientific research? Again, this is an arena where when we turn to agencies like the NSF, said it has been funded. How do scientists think of ethics? How do scientists think of values? I think that's a really ripe area which could be pushed forth a lot. The third one that I would talk about would be that STS at one time had a really coherent kind of an agenda because it sort of arose as a movement which questioned big science. And now what we have is multiple technologies, multiple ways of, within STS, multiple ways of examining the effects or the impacts, the genesis of those technologies. And we have so multiple methodologies. So at first glance, if you take over as editor of RPR, the field looks really kind of incoherent. What you then begin to see within it is these sort of certain agendas being pushed forth. Zach Taylor with his innovation agenda, somebody else with the environmental agenda, then the IT folks say, we're not going to contribute to this journal because we've got our own. So the connections are getting lost. The fact is, if Treasury wants to do financial services research, it brings in science technology research, it brings in cybersecurity experts, it brings in information technology experts, and if you bring in consumer behavior, there are a lot of things. So we need people to be making those connections and not push up into silos. So I think that's an arena for future STS scholars to take up. In what ways can we now start to connect the dots, not to make this a coherent field? Maybe the strength of the field is in its incoherence, in the fact that there are various silos, but there are very important questions across those silos which need to get asked. And I think those would be beneficial for future policy. To summarize then, I think we've gone from technology assessment to deliberation, and we need a lot of work done on deliberation, and especially finding out how the scientists think about it. Similarly, the related thing in terms of science and technology values, where they come from, how they influence agendas, and thirdly, in terms of making the connections among various silos.
Well, one of the benefits of going last on a discussion like this is I get to build upon the wonderful comments that my colleagues have already shared. So briefly, my name is Dorothy Miller. I'm a scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency. I work within our Office of Research and Development. So that could be, of course, acronym-tized to EPA ORD. And within EPA ORD, we have a two-faced, according to this panel, and that we're both supplying the research as well as demanding the research. For those of you who know EPA, we are, of course, a regulatory agency. We base our decisions upon the scientific foundation that the agency supplies, that the community supplies. But we also are a research institution, a science institution. And so maybe instead of the notes I have here, I can, again, build upon those comments and share a little about how we are reshaping the way we do our research in response to the demands we're given. So maybe I can do both faces at once with that. So within the Office of Research and Development, we had a paradigm wherein single-track or siloed research disciplines aligned with really our regulatory and statutory authorities. So a drinking water research program, a water quality research program, aligning with, of course, the Water Pollution Prevention and Safe Drinking Water Acts, passed by the Senate. Just over the past year or so, we've stepped back and said that really the problems that we're facing in the 21st century are not necessarily fundamentally different than the problems we faced 40 years ago. We've just made the huge gains that we already could. We don't have rivers on fire anymore. We don't have statues that are dissolving in the rain. But we still have a ways to go to protect human health and the environment in this country. However, to make the gains necessary to do that, to meet that mission goal, we need the scientific tools to think more complexly, if I can use that as a new word here. So I heard the emphasis from Kay on this social and behavioral economic science and the need for that, investment in that. That's something we have recognized, although I do say we call it the SBED, and add the decision sciences on there. Most of what people do, we don't necessarily need to know only about how they behave in behavioral sciences. We don't necessarily need to know only, say, the communication, the assessment, or the economics, but we need to put that into a construct where people can make decisions. Community level, the regional level, the federal level. So really adding the decision sciences is a component that we at EPA and the ORD have identified as an investment opportunity for our research and S&T needs. You know, we really fundamentally haven't, I'll say we've changed the way we're working as well as building upon the strengths. So if I take the water examples, the drinking water research program and the water quality research program, and I step back from that and I take a systems perspective, I say, well, water doesn't just magically appear at the pumping station and enter the drinking water system. Nor does it just magically go elsewhere when it exits that system. How do we pull those research programs together, those research emphases together, so that we have the hydrological sphere? The water is a complete system. We can't just solve a problem in, say, water and move it to air, or vice versa. Similarly, we can't just solve a drinking water problem and have that be a water quality problem. So really stepping back and formulating problems with a systems perspective is another area that we're investing in heavily, and certainly have rearranged our research programs to reflect that emphasis. Now I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but stepping back and understanding the community, the program, the policy arena that will use the research before embarking on the research is a critical component that we're investing in right now. That's the linchpin to solving those problems, is understanding those problems up front, engaging with the people who will use the research throughout the lifetime of the research, so we don't end up with something that then has to be marketed around. As I said on an earlier panel, I'm a physical chemist. When I was doing research, I had a really pretty coin. I did my research very well. I had this great project. But in the broader context, that doesn't matter as much as how that piece fits into somebody else's values, as was mentioned here. So understanding the values of what we do, understanding the way in that research is communicated, understanding the way in which we can balance the risks and benefits of what we do, the decisions we make, in a fashion that really preserves our natural resources for future generations. I'm seeing that as the emphasis within ORD, and I think that is very responsive to both our supply side and the demand side within the agency. I brought with me one copy of our recent research progress report, if anybody is interested, but it highlights the different areas that we are working with. So taking what we're now calling our air research program, and including aspects of air quality, of biofuels, of energy. They could be unrelated, but if you only look at biofuels research, you're missing the broader context under which decisions have to be made. And those are not only decisions for what the land use will be in a local area, but also the broader economic decisions, the broader environmental environmental decisions that we all have to make, either as consumer or on the government side, regulator, enforcer, etc. Yeah, so I think that's where I would be stopped here and actually just, echo back to the crowd. Where and how do you see this happening? I think possibly we'll get to that on this one.
That's great. Thanks, Dorothy. Absolutely.
So, sorry, I guess I'll take your thunder. I will be the privilege of taking off everyone else's points. The one is there is an interesting consistency between what JP has said and what the way I sort of think. But I also was originally someone who studied environmental science and natural resource management, and then switched into politics and political science for all sorts of interesting reasons. But one of the mandates, personal mandates, when I came in to be editor was twofold. One is I want more comparative work, and I want more international scholarship. Those 2 points do not necessarily fundamentally alter anything that RPR or STEP section has been doing. And I think we see that even from the discussion of 2 panels today. One individual after the STAR metrics panel was talking about Brazil having a model that has been important in trying to learn how this STAR metrics is applied. So where is the paper that talks about learning from Brazil or how we see these applied differently in these 2 different contexts? Why don't we see more north-south comparison when in fact they're dealing with very similar issues? The panel just before this one was on food, biotechnology, biosecurity, issues around BT cotton, for example. So part of my work is in East Africa, and I know full well there's very engaging, interesting debate about how these processes are unfolding. So why don't we learn from what's happened in other contexts, and why don't we see that research taking place? And for me, that's ultimately about deliberation. It's also about pushing a comparative politics and comparative policy approach to STP to work. And I think that's extraordinarily important, but there's a very good pragmatic reason why it's not being done. And that's because it's hard. And it's hard to do it because of time. It's hard to do it because of access to information. And it's also hard to do it because, in fact, we don't get the same recognition often for doing, ST work in developing countries, or it doesn't get the same attention that it would if you're doing it in North American or European context. So with respect to RPR, the journal that the review of policy research, there is more comparative work coming in, but I suspect you could probably guess what kind of comparative work it is. It is largely statistical, and it's quantitative in terms of its comparative outcome. So that's wonderful. It shows us a lot of generalizable outcomes. But it's not telling us the deep, dirty, gritty stories about deliberation, about politics, about protest, or about winners and losers in terms of ST issues, and certainly about values. So to put a mandate or to ask, well, we'd like more. I like more of both. I want mixed methods. That's a tall order. It's a very tall order. It's hard to accomplish. But most importantly, I think it'll certainly, in the end, provide certainly a more interesting output with respect to truly understanding the nature of how this research issues are taking place. The last 2 points I want to make is a call for the low politics of ST research. The low politics bit from what Dorothy said, why don't we know more about the bureaucratic approach of response to ST issues? So what's going on within EPA? In my own country, in Canada, what's going on in the province of the Ministry of the Environment in Ontario? It's fascinating to see the number of times that they've switched structures to respond to the same issue over a period of 15 years. Well, let's put all the policies of the sectors together into the same policy unit. Actually, no, that doesn't work very well because you actually need specialists. So let's take those back, and let's now have air branch, policy branch, the air branch, water branch, land branch. These are extraordinarily important problems. But we don't actually see a lot of people trying to understand the administration, the bureaucratic approach to these issues. There's good reason for that. It's hard to get inside. Right? It's a big black box. It's an old story about politics. But when we do get it, it offers such an important glimmer into the nature of how debates and issues are actually materialized. So I would keep pushing for that. And the last is non-state-based forums and deliberation around environmental issues. So there's a conference now in Durban. A few people are talking about climate change again. The reality is that's not entirely the best place to be looking for climate change solution and climate change answers. subnational, international, and non-government-based mechanisms, forums, are in fact proving to be extraordinarily important vehicles and places to understand the nature of the future of politics around SDE and certainly environmental issues.
Great. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for the great introductions and discussions of the 2 or 3 issues that they felt were important. I too am going to throw away my notes. I had about six questions, but now after hearing everyone, I'm going to reframe one and ask the panelists to comment, and then I'll ask folks from the audience to add their own questions. You know, most of us, at least in my generation, are certainly familiar with President Kennedy's audacious goal back in the 60s of putting a man on the moon by the end of the century. Sorry, sir. President Kennedy's goal in the 1960s of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. It seems that in discussing some of these points of deliberation, politics, process, values, the field looking incoherent, big science, big politics, that balancing supply and demand, many politicians appear to be kicking the can down the road and avoiding big suggestions such as why don't we have America with 20% renewable energy capacity by the end of this decade. So I'd like to frame that out since each of you has heard your fellow panelists to say why don't we have a big audacious goal that politics and science can get together and support and say that we're going to do something like 20% renewable energy by the end of this decade? Any volunteers?
I think we have micro goals in policy that are pushed. We just heard about genetic engineering in the past panel. The US is pushing that. We have micro goals in intellect. I can only speak to global governance, and so I'm happy to hear that the comparative and the international agenda continue because I was trained in international political economy. But if I look within that tradition, there are 2 or 3 big agendas that US government has. Intellectual property is a big agenda. Cyber infrastructures is a big agenda. Genetic engineering is a big agenda. Space exploration is a big agenda. So there are those. And then thinking about sustainability from security aspects is a huge agenda. Now, they don't sound like putting a man on the moon, but I think those are agendas. And I'm glad that they're getting globally contested and challenged and shaped. And I think US government itself is doing a much better job now of getting input from various places and framing those policies than I think it used to do in Kennedy's time.
I would say we actually have a very audacious goal out there. There's just maybe not the level of attention. With the Affordable Health Care Act, that's an audacious goal to have the country insured. It underlying science and tech going with that, lots of different components in this, but it's a move for the country from treat the sick to keep them well. If we are able to achieve that goal, the days of productivity skyrocket, the quality of life in our communities improves, possibilities underlying something like that are very concrete and very lofty. But if we want to talk about doable and a lofty goal, I would say that there is one right now that we're working on. It's just not maybe putting a man on a moon.
I would say that there are no shortage of ambitious goals, but I think the shortage is ones that actually get traction.
Mm-hmm.
And people rally around to get it accomplished. So, I mean, that's one. It's hard to think of, I mean, this president has put forward a number of similar audacious, ambitious goals. They have not been adopted to the extent that the healthcare reform law was. And previous presidents have also done that. I mean, ever since, even if you look at the space race, I mean, there are presidents that said, oh, we're going to Mars. And we haven't, but that was a fairly ambitious goal. And now the current one is, oh, well, humans are going to some body within the solar system other than the moon. And we'll see. We'll see if that is actually adopted, if there's enough buy-in from the public and Congress and everyone else to get that done. So, I mean, I think that's, but an interesting political science question. You know, how do you get take-up, adoption of proposed goals from the public or from political leaders?
I'll give you the answer.
Okay.
Back when I was in physics, the line was if you wanted to get your project funded, then the closer you could tie your grant to security, the more likely you get funded. Why? Because we live in a democracy, and science is very expensive. And if people are going to pay their hard-earned tax dollars for that as opposed to something else, they want to know that you're handling one of their problems, preferably want something they feel very threatened by. So we went out to the moon because the Russians were beating us up there. We had to go counter that, right? And now that we don't have that sort of threat, we sort of see it as something superfluous, something we can cut. And if this is correct, then going forward, I would think that our science spending is going to be less and less on DARPA or NSF type of research and more on NIH type of research, because there are how many 70 million baby boomers about to head into retirement in old age, and boy, nothing threatens like imminent death and degrading dignity of life. And they're going to spend their hard-earned tax dollars so that we can research the cures to Alzheimer's, heart disease, cancer. In a way, that's a good thing. That'll solve some problems. But what I see in various countries, the countries that are good at technology have this real sense of threat out there for which S&T is the solution. And the countries which do not do well at S&T usually have internal divisions, different economic groups or regions or ethnicities. They're kind of fighting over the goodies, and S&T just exacerbates those fights. So that's how I kind of see why there's buy-in sometimes and not others.
Last point would be, for me, the grand narrative and the inability to articulate a grand narrative about what the ultimate goal is. I think having a competitor is very important. But any grand narrative, unless it is supremely welcomed, is going to be challenged from multiple directions. So whether it's blogs, whether it's interest groups, whether it's financial threat. So the capacity to articulate a grand vision, a grand narrative that doesn't get challenged and doesn't get ripped apart in multiple morsels is a huge, huge way to undermine any grand vision for policy action. It helps when you have, as Zach points out, a good enemy. But there are multiple enemies and multiple competitors now. And so the idea that you can rally behind an idea when it's going to be challenged the second it's put out is certainly doesn't parallel historically what we do.
Yes.
I think one of the differences between your ought to go and finding a man on the moon is that finding a man on the moon is very specific, well-defined target, you can tell whether you did it or not. And all these others, they're much more nebulous. And if you only make 19% of renewable energy in the country, does that meet the goal or not in Paris? You know, you want something that you know whether it did it or not. Now, the goal should have been to establish a colony outside of the Earth so that we will survive as a species. That is not pinpointed enough that it's really what they should have been thinking. But that's the value of space research. Make us invulnerable to threats to the Earth.
So we're talking about values. Another comment?
There are two factors that we haven't heard about, which I think are big elephants in the room for pardon that. One is the poisonous partisan politics on capitalism. And the second are the severe budgetary constraints, which we are clearly showing. And I'd like any of the panelists to comment on those two factors and the impact that they have on the demand for science and technology policies.
I guess, playing again on a similar theme, some of it is a sign of how, it sounds controversial, but how relatively good things are. We do not have some great external threat against us, so people are splitting off their own little industries and fighting over the good, and that's reflecting the intense partisanship. And it's not the worst in our history. You can go back into the previous century, back in the 1800s, and see more intense partisanship. So we've been through these cycles. But maybe if China's kind of a threat, but they have similar problems internally. They're probably not going to innovate in any way that really threatens us. So, you know, it's the old, if you're sitting fat, dumb, and happy, you're not going to innovate because you don't have to. If you're absolutely terrified, you're not going to innovate because you don't have the stability to do so. There's sort of a creative insecurity for this to happen. And I don't know what's going to come. Maybe global warming will be the threat that does it. I'm not sure.
I would only add that one thing that keeps coming up over and over again, so the premier body funding our research is NSF, and one thing that partisan politics always do is to try to cut the social behavior and economic sciences division every time. So then you're testifying on the government trying to keep funding for scholars like who's working in STS and Cooking. And so, yeah, that's a pity.
Someone else have a hand up over here?
A wicked observation of making this, I've been hearing in other places as well. Scientists and engineers aren't doing a terribly good job of listening to the larger public themselves. Like, for instance, the race to the moon. Those of us who are old enough remember where we were on July 20th, watching that little step onto the moon. How many people remember Apollo 12? The TV ratings dropped so much for Apollo 12. The only reason I remember Apollo 13 is the rather good movie that's been made about it. And at the time I was a young physicist, so I should have been paying more attention. And people weren't because it wasn't integrated into their life a lot.
Same with the space shuttle.
Huh?
Same with the space shuttle. Initially it was very popular, and then, you know, people got bored by it.
Yeah, well, it's like when you talk about security, people are still doing things in response to 9/11 that frankly don't make any sense, but it's something, it's a big thing that scared the hell out of people. That, I think, is, we need to have a better integration of science and technology with larger.
Sir?
Yes. Each of the panelists in his or her own way was talking about the future. And yet none of you used the word futurist. Nobody talked about the absence of that talent within government. I live in Washington. I know hundreds of futurists, and I don't know anyone who was a significant employee of government. In fact, a few of them I know washed out in the last decade. Now that reflects your own ignorance. It reflects the fact that you have no regard and hence no respect for people who look out 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And there are several hundred of them in the United States. There's no excuse for that panel not knowing the word futurist, except that they were a bit too lazy to find out. Okay? If you're looking for somebody to do something, you would normally look for somebody in the phone book who had the right words after his name. But apparently none of you do that. And until you shape up and look at the future explicitly, and who has something to teach you, and who has something that you can learn from, then you're just going to wallow as you did today. A rather uninteresting discussion. It started nowhere and went nowhere. And that's because none of you have any real interest in the future, even to go so far as finding out the names of one or two of them. Do any of you know the names of a futurist in the United States?
Joseph Coates, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe because, governance, and, all of you guys are working for the government, and once you are governing, you're basically responding to crisis. And you don't have time to think and reason out 20 years. So I think the idea is to think of ideas, keep them in your back pocket. When the political climate changes, or when they come running and say, what should we do, that those ideas should be out. And I think generally federal agencies don't even do that now. They have goals, but there is less needed. There is there's not enough specifics of what we should go about doing. I do have a question related to climate change. For 20 years almost, the federal enterprise suggested that the country and the world should do something about climate change. And we did nothing. I have not read any article, and maybe I just am not reading enough, any reason of why that happened. The argument that politicians are bad, the politics is messed up, those are not the reasons. Those are maybe reasons, but there are other aspects to that. For the panel, do you guys have any opinion on that? Why do you think for 20 years, we have been unable to move this thing forward?
Well, there's not a national consensus that the United States government should do, climate change policy of the kinds that we've been talking about. And I don't detect public consensus or even a public majority that the United States government should do climate change policy along the cap and trade or international agreements to limit carbon emissions that people talk about. And I don't think that's
I think that's part of the problem. What's interesting is back in 2005, a group of college presidents got together and formed the American College and University Presidents Climate Committee, where all the signers of that original commitment were dedicated to saying that we want to be carbon neutral by a date within the next 50 years. Some schools will be easier than others. And initially there were a couple hundred charter signers, and now I believe there's 680 signers. There are 4,300 colleges and universities in the United States, so not everyone has embraced it, but the original 100 who did, and subsequent ones that latched on said, there's this debate on climate change, and the American public is vastly divided, as Kay just said. But we believe it's an issue based on what we see, what we hear from our faculty, and we're willing to commit our campus and our university to being carbon neutral in a 50-year period. And it actually, interestingly enough, there was an initial report required, and it's only now, since the formation of the organization in 2006, it's been 5 years, but every 2 years you have to issue a progress report if you're going to maintain your membership. So I understand the comment about futures, and I understand specifically your comment about climate change and the debate. I happen to be on the side that we need to do something, and so my institution, I signed that commitment as a charter signer.
Yeah, I was referring to science organizations because I feel that science is supposed to get rid of those biases and achieve, with evidence, you can convince people that this is what we are doing right now is not good and what we should do something about it. So the inability to convince the country is a failure in as far as I can see. And maybe I'm just being
I disagree, because science can and does tell you what is happening to our planet, right? And the U.S. government, public is perfectly willing to invest a lot of resources in understanding the dimensions of climate change. And so we understand better than ever. But science will never tell you what societies should do to respond to that. And that's a values, it's a political decision. And that, of course, there's a lot of disagreements still as to what the value is and therefore what the political decision should be. And so it's not science's job to convince people that they should do something. No, science's job is to understand, to help inform the public and all of us, what's happening to the Earth. And then it's up to us to take that knowledge and do something or to do nothing.
No, I agree that there is EPA has research into climate to kind of change the impacts across the different areas that would be affected by that. But that's to increase the understanding. And what you do with that research is it's the values, as you said, it's the decisions of the society. But the science itself is the science. It's the information.
Could I speak to this too, please? I'm Linda Silvers, the ambassador of the National Festivals of Climate Change and the World Voters. But first I wanted to point out something I heard in an earlier seminar today, which happened to be about tobacco. And it was about menthol cigarettes, and the research showed that they ought to be banned. But all of a sudden, when that came out, huge list of industry companies opposed it and came up with their own research saying that that was true, they didn't want to ban it. Let's be realistic. There is a huge lobby that is funding the people who say climate change doesn't exist. And the money comes from the fuel industries and from the coke growers. And that's life.
Let me quickly add that I don't think the American public is not for climate change. Public opinion surveys show that they are, but the problem may be in the politics in two ways. One, the anti-climate change arguments and how well funded it is. And second, at the global level, we haven't figured out how to divide this responsibility of providing the public good. The Annex 1 countries versus the other countries. Who should pay for it? If China is the number one global emitter, then can we make China pay when it, United States didn't have to pay in the past for where it got to. So I think that's where the tricky questions for economists and political scientists are. How do we come up with a formula for those payments and also deal with the effects of a lobby that is very well funded?
In one of the earlier seminars, it was pointed out that we're going to weigh what China is producing versus what we're producing. Do we count in the U.S. what China's producing for us?
Right.
And are those emissions U.S. emissions or Chinese emissions?
But getting back to, I think, the topic of the panel, I think it is an important area of research. In that, we have kind of the scientific basis for understanding climate change, and it's getting better. But we still have some work to do on I would call it decision science of how do you make decisions about global problems on a global basis. What are the policy mechanisms that we have? And how do you enforce international agreements or rights? And how do you allocate kind of the costs as well as the benefits of potential actions?
You have a question?
Well, one of the things I keep thinking, though, of course, this is a pressing issue to look at the global thing. Out of that same session, the previous session, came this idea that when we address these issues at the more abstract level, you cannot get past the normative debate, which then freezes your room for action. But when you go down to the local levels where there are actual acute problems, all the complexities are more feasible, that they can be discussed outside of this heated abstract normative debate. And people are more willing to attack. So I was just thinking the grand narrative of science should be to go down to the small story, basically.
I like that, though. I think the question is, so if we can make progress with this willingness to take action at some of these small-scale manifestations of problems, what if the true solutions actually do require global coordinated action?
Well, that is the problem, but I think the way that things coordinate on a global scale is decentralized.
Right.
So as a government, you don't want that.
Right. Yeah.
I'd like to know if my 50,000-year plan qualifies me as a futurist. Now, my 50,000-year plan says we should require oil companies to plant peatbogs so that in 50,000 years we have more oil. But the purpose of the plan is to point out the futility of planning in the far distant future. Nobody will support a 50,000-year plan because they're not going to be around to enjoy it. It may be that our survival as a species depends on what happens in the long term. So I think we should look ahead, do things that will not kill us in 50,000 years anyway, and look that far ahead for planning in the nearer term, like for the next 100 years. It used to be that churches were the only organizations that could plan 100 years in the future. They can't do it now. They can only plan a year in the future because of budgetary problems. So how can we get long-term plans that make sense?
I had a question, not a comment. So I just wanted to ask, we were talking about these needs for increased communication, for larger thinking at a global scale and in terms of systems, what do you see coming on the horizon for education in these fields, whether you're looking at training the future scientists or the future STS scholars or future policymakers? What are the means that we can start building that as a way of thinking instead of just as, oh, we need to figure out a way to do this? Any thoughts?
Jack, you want to start?
I mean, I'm at a state university, so maybe that gives me some perspective. But I see education being increasingly customized across the country. So different universities and non-university institutions are trying to build particular audiences according to whatever budget, in the same way a business might, focusing a lot more on money and financial sustainability. I wonder if universities aren't becoming sort of the new high school in some degree. I know in places that don't have pricing power like ours, we get more and more students in our classes, 100, 200 students per class, which means we have to resort to things like multiple choice tests. So I still think the best students were that top, the smartest 5%, we're still churning those out, and I think that matters. Hopefully the rest of them will come along for the ride, but I'm sort of optimistic on the best and the brightest, I'm pessimistic on the brightest.
Should we do anything?
So I go to Geneva every year and take my students from Georgetown, and I was meeting with somebody from the World Economic Forum once, and she said, so what were you doing this afternoon? I said, I was grading, and she said, oh, what was the paper? And I said, oh, it was a little frustrating. This student was writing about intellectual property issues in China and gave me a model on how those issues can be resolved and what needs to be done. If only Microsoft had a better pricing strategy, there would be no piracy. And so she said, why is that frustrating for you? And I said, because I expected a social sciencey paper on what is rather than what should be. And she said, your students are problem solving, but why do you have a problem with that? And so it really stopped me in my tracks, and I've been thinking a lot about it. And I think that our education is predicated towards what is, and problem solving is not a vocational activity that should be just left to vocational schools. And I think we need more of a problem-solving component so we can answer better the kind of questions that you were asking. What are the possible solutions here? We need that case study approach in our classes to say, ask students if you were China today and you have more simulations so that people are forced to problems and not just write the papers strictly according to a particular kind of a methodology which gets published in a journal. So that'll be one. And the second thing I think that's happening, which I expect will continue, is more and more interdisciplinary programs. So the disciplinary programs are not going to like us because we take away their faculty lines, etc. But the call of the day clearly is interdisciplinarity. But interdisciplinarity without problem solving will again end up replicating the same power structure. So I hope that we can move on towards problem solving.
And I would actually say, let's just do it also. I think that's what we're doing at EPA. Just earlier this week, there was the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, signed between EPA and the Army to demonstrate what we're calling net zero on Army bases. I don't exactly know what the solutions are to get Army bases to water zero, so they reuse all the water that they have there, the waste, zero, energy zero, energy neutral, so similar to the university example. But we can work together to figure out the opportunities, pilot them on those bases, put them in a framework that communities can adopt, and move forward with that. So a lot of times we can overanalyze. Certainly within ORD, we're talking about transdisciplinary and integrated and really pulling across the available resources we have, the intellectual resources, and moving towards the let's do it. Let's demonstrate this, let's learn from it, let's move it out the door so that this can be useful for folks. And so net zero.
One on this point is I think is, let's not be apologetic about interdisciplinary work. I think there's still a real sense of that. And one of the values of RPR and other journals that are eclectic is that, come all, come one, we'll figure out how they fit together. I follow JP's observations about the way students are learning, but I am still a big stickler for skills. And I would push this on the science side. We're still a bit shocked every time the scientist who has the credentials of a scientist steps up and writes a sort of quite polemical book about what they see and writes a narrative. we heard a panel earlier about narratives and science. So we need to have students learning the skills of communication. I'm just quite dumbstruck about how uncomfortable people are at graduate school, at upper level undergraduate, about communicating ideas, about making an argument that's coherent, about finding a way to do it that doesn't use PowerPoint, speaking in front of an audience, sharing an idea. This seems so mundane and so simple, but if we're going to deal with complex problems and people can't figure out how to communicate their ideas clearly amongst a diverse audience, then we're really going to be suffering, I think.
Get Toastmasters.
You can't teach that stuff on multiple choice tests.
But I tend to agree with Zach in the sense that I think that we're okay with about 5%. And I think it's below that 5%. If you look at the latest stats on engineering students, 50% of them drop out. This is the national average within the first year. And those are the ones that we were somehow taught and convinced into majoring in engineering. So we have to do a better job of finding ways to encourage people and also to prepare people better for science and technology at the high school level, so that when they enter college, they have the confidence. I think on the good side is that, science is pretty demanding, and so we haven't compromised our standards like we may have with multiple choice in some other subjects. But nonetheless, it's rather discouraging with the high dropout rate and the lower participation.
To follow Professor Singh's comment, there was a survey that shows the Chinese students always think that innovation will come from problem solving, while American students always think innovation comes from the basic research. There's a huge culture difference in that. But my question is, if you look at our R&D budget, almost half goes to the defense department. That's military weaponry, specific project programs. And non-defense half goes to NIH. The rest of it, the science is just kind of a little bit. I mean, altogether, I still think that technology, this assessment of all these programs needs to be more accurate, more precise. Whether the cost and benefit analysis should be done more accurately. So my question to you is, do you think there will be some kind of reprioritized federal R&D in the future? Out of the routine, like peer review, all that general stuff.
I guess I agree with some of what you're saying about better evaluation, better tools are always better. But the allocation, I don't think they're likely to change because they're long-standing and they are for political reasons. So you can tell a lot about a nation by what kind of spending it prioritizes. And within that, you can tell a lot about a nation by what kinds of research the nation prioritizes. So if you look at it, well, obviously, we think health and defense R&D are pretty important. And that's not something that can change right away because I think it does reflect long-standing preferences that haven't changed much in several decades. If anything, if we look at health, it's likely to expand because we are only likely to be more concerned about health in the years to come. Defense, maybe less so. So it's not really a research question. It's not a policy research question. It's a question of, what are the relative values that our political system assigns to various topics within our research portfolio. And that mix does change over time. And there are certainly attempts to change it. For example, there's an attempt to make sure that energy research portfolio is a much larger share. But I don't know.
One last question.
Well, this goes back perhaps to values, which was brought up as a factor in a couple of the different seminars today. And it also sort of challenges this thing that we've done the science, somebody else decides to do it. I'm thinking that scientists need a different set of values. And I trained as a scientist myself. As a graduate student in 1965, I knew that if we didn't do something about it, we were going to have tremendous problems with anti-bad businesses. And none of us spoke up. Here we are.
Well, scientists are also the public. That that they're not. They are not two separate groups. So I think that insight it resonates. We as members of the public, we all bring our specific areas of knowledge and expertise. But we're all in it together. It's not like the public is just outside the walls of the Carnegie Institution.
Oh, with that, I think we are adjourned.
Yes.